on what is a new way to look at a new lens on matters in extreme conditions and opportunities in the future for a variety of science cases. And it's really an exciting time in high energy density science, in plasma physics, in earth sciences. There are a whole variety of opportunities for exploration. This ranges from planet formation studies at extreme conditions and moderate to high strain rate. You can think about high energy density plasma environments, ranging from opportunities for clean energy in fusion energy technology and science, out to studying the interiors of larger and larger planets. In fact, exoplanets, there's something like over 4,000 exoplanets now validated or confirmed, I should say, of which something like 18 to 20 are in the habitable zone, possibly for life. And this is really exciting. So understanding the constituent properties of those planetary interiors is ever more important and urgent. Understanding the interior of our own planet. We're going to actually talk about the core a little bit today. And then looking forward to novel materials properties, materials by design. How can we leverage the unique thermodynamic path that materials that undergo exposure to extreme conditions, in extreme environments of pressure, temperature, and so forth? How can we actually design novel materials that benefit humanity overall? And part of the way we do this is, thank you, Bob Cobble, is actually looking, probing the materials that we generate at these extreme conditions using a suite of light sources. And today we're going to focus on an X-ray free electron laser as a probe. Could also be used as a pump. But that new light, that new way of looking at materials in the ultra fast, with time scales that are shorter than a phonon period, really a freeze frame of what's going on. And so I just show here a variety of application spaces of topical areas, really, where you can leverage different light sources around the globe to study your materials at extreme states. And in particular, we're going to talk about laser-driven shockwave work today, but there's a whole host of exciting facilities coming online or are already online. And it's part of the, I think, the mission of this community to share with each other where those advancements are taking place and where the future needs to go, and having community engagement in and advocacy for what are the new technologies we want to bring to bear on matter at extremes. So my area of emphasis and use really in being here at the SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory is leveraging X-ray free electron laser technology to probe. And our only domestic X-ray free electron laser happens to be the LCLS, the LINAC coherent light source. And so this is a really unique instrument. It is currently, now we've got competition internationally, but it was the first hard X-ray free electron laser with tunability. And in recent years, in about the past five to 7 years, there's been even more tailored tailored approaches to how we deliver the X-ray beam to users, to scientists, and then apply to our different science cases. So for one thing is controlled polarization. So when we talk about some of the different techniques, and some of them I will go into more detail here, but different correlation spectroscopy techniques, different imaging techniques, inelastic X-ray scattering opportunities. There's a whole range where being able to manipulate the polarization is really important. Let's talk about time scale. So notionally, our pulse, a single pulse, is a few tens of femtoseconds. So let's just pause here for a second. When we're thinking about shock physics, we're often considering time scales of nanoseconds, transit of a shock wave in a material. of order, a few nanoseconds, microns per nanosecond. But this is able, or with these tens of femtosecond timescales, you can actually be, you're shorter, you're probing, the pulse width is shorter than a phonon period. But now we're talking about attosecond technology. So nanosecond to femtosecond is 1,000,000 times shorter. And then this is another factor of 1,000 down to attosecond. So we're really able, this notion of diffract before destroy, or your probe is essentially invisible to your target. So there's a lot of value in the shorter timescales in terms of exploration of material across its phase space. There's also different kinds of flavors of X-ray beams we're able to deliver in the content of bandwidth and brightness. And so this SASE beam, SASE is the self-amplified spontaneous emission, and its bandwidth is fairly large, still shorter or smaller, however, than what we would typically get from a synchrotron light source. But we can use a seeded beam now, which means our bandwidth is even more narrow, and the brightness has a factor of 40 increase, which is wonderful. And then there's also pulse train opportunities where we are spacing the X-ray pulses in much shorter buckets, spacings of 350 picoseconds at the shortest amount. But then you can vary that spacing up to a few to tens to hundreds of nanoseconds. So now you can craft your own unique time scale of probing, time structure that is valuable for a wide variety of science cases, and particularly well matched to aspects of shock physics. And springboarding off of that, the pulse train actually application in concert with detector development has been really strategic. So here I show work that we did several years ago, first of all, on the right-hand side, using this 4-pulse train. So the spacing between the X-ray pulses is a few nanoseconds, but the detector, this Icarus, is a hybrid CMOS detector built in collaboration with Sandia National Lab and Livermore, deployed at SLAC to look at hard X-ray diffraction and imaging. And so we did a small study on gold, but then later on in the talk, you'll hear more about how we're leveraging it to do in situ imaging of a shock transiting a feature. And this feature in our case is going to be a void that we are wanting to examine how it's collapsing, the physics process of that void collapse. And so I want to also call out some of the great work done by a grad student working with us at Brigham Young University, Daniel Hodge, and my postdoc, Sylvia Pandolfi. And so this is an article that came out last year looking at the first deployment of this UXI camera and the ultra-fast X-ray imaging camera and the 4-pulse train from LCLS. And we do all of this work. Our pump is several opportunities for laser platforms here at the Matter in Extreme Conditions hutch. So this is the very last end station in a series. And at the MEC instrument, there are sort of 2 flavors of experiments that can go on. You can do sort of more traditional shock physics using a long pulse laser. So this is notionally 60 to 80 joules in 2 omega. There is pulse shaping capability somewhere between 5 and probably 20 nanoseconds. This is a bit of a stretch. And we can shoot that laser currently once every 7 minutes. Okay, so we're looking at pseudo rep-rated targetry as the other angle that we need to explore here, and that's really important too as we look forward into how to investigate aspects of inertial fusion energy. Because if we want to take what we understand about thermonuclear ignition and translate that into a possible clean energy source, one of the concepts that's being discussed is laser-based. And in doing that at high rep rate is really key. So understanding as we move forward how to optimize for high rep rate targetry is really key. It's even more important when you go to the short pulse laser opportunities also at MEC. And so here there's a 25 terawatt laser at 5 hertz. This is aspect of MEC's work that I am not as much engaged in, but it is available to users. And then over here on the right-hand side, I just show sort of a traditional temperature density plot that really showcases the wide variety of phase space that we are interested in for a number of reasons. And most of the work today will be focused in the condensed matter regime, but certainly there are opportunities, exciting opportunities to leverage LCLS and XFELS in general for looking at warm dense material and hot dense plasmas, of course. Okay, so finally we've arrived at sort of the outline of the talk. So we're connecting a couple different pieces here. We're looking at the novel characteristics of an X-ray free electron laser and combining that with state-of-the-art laser technology or near state-of-the-art laser technology to drive shock waves in materials. And we'll focus on a few different science cases. So we've got these traditional sort of different X-ray techniques that you can deploy. Diffraction, so looking at the lattice level changes in a material, the structure, the phase transformation kinetics, so resolving that change as a function of time to then build up an understanding of the mechanism of transformation. Emission spectroscopy, so there are some really exciting applications of this, including exploration of basal magma ocean physics. We're not going to get into that today, but it's certainly possible here at LCLS to collect K alpha, looking at the spin transition in iron and extracting some information about spin crossover in the lower mantle. And then there's imaging, X-ray imaging, and part of where we can leverage the coherent properties of an X-ray free electron laser is pushing forward on the resolution, spatial resolution and temporal resolution to actually extract the areal density of an image that represents our sample under a shocked state. And so we're just going to focus on these two, diffraction and imaging today. And I'm going to review two separate case studies of work we've done in the past few years. There's one that's very geophysically relevant. We're going to look at the inner core. And then one that is a more energy science applied in thinking about inhomogeneities and ablator materials, not just for ICF, but also thinking forward for IFE, inertial fusion energy applications. Okay, so case study number one, the Earth's inner core, my most favorite place. So the inner core is really weird. It's really odd. It has unusual properties. It's about the size of our moon and can reach temperatures as hot as the surface of the sun. It's a bit lopsided, right? So it's not perfectly symmetric. The inner core grain structure, it's thought that there are different regions of basically microstructure changes between very large grain to small grain. And all of these different aspects influence our geodynamo and the evolution of our planet as a whole. And part of another oddity that has been observed through seismic records is this notion of seismic anisotropy. So the compressional waves travel faster in the polar direction by about 3 to 4% than in the equatorial direction. And that gets back to possibly alignment of these crystallites with some sort of texture, preferred orientation of these crystallites in the core. But the mineral physicists of our community cannot necessarily agree on which axis is the fastest. So how is that alignment going to enable that anisotropy that's recorded? And so what we decided to do was embark on a study that looked at iron plasticity and elasticity approaching inner core conditions to understand, well, if the grains have the opportunity to align, how does that actually take place? What are the mechanisms at play that might induce this, this anisotropy in the inner core? And so part of the tools that we can use, I come from a static compression background, diamond anvil cells, and oftentimes to look at strength, to look at plasticity in a material, we leverage sort of a different way of probing with with diamond anvil cells. So typically, here's a schematic of a diamond anvil cell. And so our two diamonds here house our sample in the middle, and you apply pressure. And this is a very small area, smaller than the tip of your hair, really. And you generate these extraordinarily high pressures. And typically the X-ray probe comes through perpendicular to that stress application. But here we're actually going to send the X-rays through in a different geometry. So we're going to come through the gasket. This is a typical static compression radial X-ray diffraction. Or you can sort of tilt this. It's called tilted radial X-ray diffraction. But the idea is that we are sensitive in this case to the magnitude of the waviness of the line. So the magnitude of the deviatoric strain and the shear strength when we come in at this perpendicular probe geometry to the stress application direction. And so if you think about a material that's at pressure or hydrostatic in general, and you examine the lattice, typically the Dubai shear cones, if you take a slice through that and look at it on a detector, you have perfectly concentric cones. You have perfect circles. But when you've got a material that's experiencing some shear stress and deviatoric strain, you'll set up a few different things. First of all, you'll go from a circle to an ellipse, and you can actually generate or accrue preferred orientation within the crystallites. So when you snip and unroll or look at your diffraction pattern, you have locations where there's more intensity. So the crystallites are actually telling you they're accommodating that strain. And so you can look at lattice preferred orientation as well as effect of strength on that sample. So we decided to take this approach and, the result from that previous work a long time ago was that under static compression, looking at the strength of iron at core conditions, it's actually fairly low. So this sort of shear strength parameter that we extracted was something like 1 GPa-ish. We had a temperature, we made a temperature assumption, right? An effective temperature was not measured. And so it brings us down to something, the inner core strength is quite low. And so here's some raw data that we leveraged for doing this study. But we said, that's not good enough. We should optimize for exploring the strength at combined high pressure and temperature. And one tool we can use is dynamic compression. And so we set up to do an experiment at the MEC end station at LCLS, and we wanted to target sort of two regions on the iron hugoniot. So here I show a phase diagram of temperature and pressure, and the principal hugoniot for iron is this purple curve. And so we wanted to do something low pressure where we could compare with other types of strength measurements, and then one at very high pressure where we were approaching just at the melt bound for iron. And our geometry was very similar to what I just mentioned for radial X-ray diffraction in a diamond cell. We're coming in at a large angle with respect to the shock propagation direction. So here's my sample cassette, and my little inset here shows a foil of iron and a blader material, CH, plastic. So my shock propagation direction is indicated by this arrow, but then my probe, the LCLS, is going to come in at an angle with respect to that shock propagation direction, about 65 degrees. So it's not perfect, it's not 90, but it turns out that this sort of tilted radial X-ray diffraction geometry is still quite useful. We also tried to place our detectors. So here's a projection of the detectors around the interaction point. To collect our phase transformation from BCC iron to HCP, to optimize for azimuthal coverage, but it's tough. So I'm aware and excited for other opportunities at other light sources, like at the European XFEL, opportunities at the MEC upgrade, where we'll have better coverage, different kinds of detectors. these detectors are optimized for fast readout, 120 hertz of LCLS. And here though, right, we're operating at 1 shot per 7 minutes. So we did the best we could. And it turns out that we could learn some really interesting information about iron. So here we've snipped and unrolled those diffraction patterns. So that's what's shown in the middle here. But then we wanted to model the weight. Remember, I referred to the waviness. So how much are those lattice planes going to push back against the applied stress? And the unit cell, of course, of our phase transformed material, the HCP iron, and lattice preferred orientation. So the texture development that develops along that azimuthal line. And so we compare our raw data to a model, essentially, using software, this MAUD, material analysis using diffraction. And this was spearheaded, the analysis was spearheaded by Professor Sebastian Merkel at University of Lille. And from these data and matching, actually, we found that we were able to, even though there's a lot of gaps here, we were still able to identify that our pull coverage, looking at the axis of axial symmetry, was not too bad. Okay, so we've got enough coverage azimuthally to help guide us and constrain what is the mechanism at play for this phase transformation and the nature of the strength for HCP iron at these conditions. So in order to move forward, I have a little side note here on looking at pull figures. So one way to visualize a three-dimensional geometric structure feature like a unit cell, right? So here's an HCP grain. But in order to help us analyze these data moving forward, we needed a way, this is a sort of a traditional way of looking at preferred orientation. So you take a three-dimensional object and you project it in 2 dimensions. And so a pull figure is a really nice way to do that. More so, we can actually leverage other symmetry connections, essentially, and use inverse pull figures, which give you a representation of the sample direction and stress application, also with respect to a reference crystal system. So we don't need to be experts in pull figures, but here's what I want you to remember for the next few slides. The transformation of BCC to HCP has a few signature features that we want to look for in the pull figure. So when we phase transform to HCP, the pull figure will show us an intensity, so multiples of a random distribution that are near this part of this this wedge, this projection of alignment of the crystallites. So if we're transforming to HCP only, then we need to see an intensity that plots sort of out here along these particular axes in the HCP crystal system. If we see twinning of the HCP grain, so if we're developing a twin that looks something like this, sort of schematically, then the intensity flips and is now pointed along the C axis effectively. So these are, I just wanted a quick reminder, refresher on pull figures in case you don't think about it every day. So what did we see? Okay, so this is really exciting. So in the upper right-hand corner here, I show a phase diagram, temperature and pressure. And this is what we looked at before, the Hugonio for iron. And we tried to push as hard as we could in high pressure. We got up, we're almost to 200 GPa. We just eked it out there. Not quite 200, but almost. And so we collected a time series of these diffraction patterns at this high pressure. And each diffraction pattern was collected and analyzed using this MAUD software to reveal the pull figure sequence. And so if we come down here and we're looking at this panel C texture, initially, so I have each of these time stamped. So at about 0.6 or so nanoseconds, the texture that we see is already phase transformed into the HCP structure. But we've got a little bit of material. Remember, if we scoot in toward the C axis, we have intensity that's pointing here. It's indicative of moving toward the twinning orientation and telling us that the material itself is twinning. And what we're seeing is that within half a nanosecond, so the difference between these two time slices, right, we have complete twinning. So what would have been better, of course, is to have more fidelity, more time slices. Hindsight is always 20/20. And so certainly having better accuracy, better fidelity on collecting these different time slices would have been great to have some before and some in the middle. But what we can say is that this twinning is taking place in 500 picoseconds or less. And that in and of itself is quite remarkable, because we're approaching the time scales that are really comparable to atomistic simulations, so that we can be checking the physics models at play in looking at some of these properties of iron at extreme conditions. And then we maintain this twin. This twinning texture is shown as we march forward in time. And so then this plot over here, time scale is a function of stress. So this is like the stress felt by the HCP crystallites. And again, we probably missed the peak. So this is like the peak strength. How much is it pushing back before it twins? So let's be clear. We build up stress in the system, in the HCP crystal, and the way in which it relaxes, the way it handles that stress application is by twinning. That is the mechanism, right? So that's really exciting. So we tried to do our due diligence in making sure, do we have the mechanism right? Does this make sense? Because the dominant twinning, or I should say, there are a different variety of twins or slip planes along which iron can actually choose to deform. And so Sebastian Merkel, again, pioneered this aspect of the study and performed viscoplastic self-consistent models or simulations. And we checked out, well, what does it look like if it's prismatic slip or pyramidal? And we found that really the one that matched our data the best was this along the 101 bar 2 twinning direction. And so we could also track how much axial compression is causing this twin to take place, and it was about 10%. So again, the opportunity here for X-ray free electron lasers to sort of shine a light on the mechanism that maybe is simulated, is a possibility, but then really coming up with that proof and visualizing that in a temporal sequence in situ. That's really the value here, and a transformative application of XFEL technology in HED science. Okay, so this is just a review of what we just talked about. There's an initial elastic response, and it builds up and it builds up, and then we finally reach the yield strength, or this elastic plastic transition. We probably missed it, right? So if I had just taken another time slice in here, but that's how it happens. And moreover, where we do have opportunities to study this system and similar systems at other facilities with better coverage, azimuthal coverage, so it gets back to the detector, this sort of study will become routine, I think, and we'll be able to suss out issues in the physics models at play. So then there's a relaxation effect, and this happens, I think, over much longer time scales, and we can actually compare to other strength measurements to see where we fit. I do want to mention, though, at lower pressure, so here again is our little cute phase diagram. And so we also have a suite of time series here down at low pressure. And so here's an example. And we see just the transformation texture to HCP. We never see evidence of twinning, okay? So we just sort of have a yield strength barrier here. We're right below it. And we don't actually, there's a threshold, right? We don't actually ever cross over at this pressure range into kicking it into to relieve that stress application by twinning. So here's the take home message here before I move on to case study 2 is that we looked at this stress, differential stress, little t here, you can think of as strength of iron. The HCP iron is the function of pressure, and we're actually plotting our work. Our red dots are shown here from the LCLS with respect to a few other studies. And there was another really interesting study done by Yuan Ping at Livermore, and she showed very high strength. Her approach and definition of strength using plastic work is a bit different than our crystallographic investigations here. But what's really interesting is that, you know, I mentioned, I think we missed the peak strength. So what we're saying is that it could be much higher than what we measured at the highest pressure. But that overall, actually, Hemley is probably pretty close at longer time scales. So eventually, there's a longer term flow strength that settles in, but that peak just before it twins is probably generating quite, manifesting quite high strength in the iron. And this is likely due to not enough defects able to mobilize appropriately in this time scale. And so we're sort of in a phonon drag controlled situation for the defect kinetics. So what does that mean for the core? Well, it's probably not directly applicable. I mean, I think that I've been asked this question before. I think it's interesting to study at the extreme pressures and temperatures that approach core conditions, what the likely deformation mechanisms are. It's more of a foundational physics measurement and not something where we can deduce a key observable, understand in better detail a key observable of the core. But nevertheless, it's really important to be aware of these properties of iron at extreme conditions in that consideration. So we're going to move on to something entirely different, which is a more applied space where we're trying to actually solve a problem. And this problem has to do with inhomogeneities in materials. And so in the inertial confinement fusion community, the targetry that's used, the materials that are used in these targets when you implode a fuel to generate thermonuclear ignition, aspects of the targetry in terms of perfection, it's really important because many of these inhomogeneities, defects, chemical impurities, even surface roughness, modulation can all play a role in degrading the symmetry of the implosion. And so here is just one example where really what we'd prefer in this image is a perfect sphere. And you can see these spikes here are generated by instabilities that have likely been seeded by a number of these imperfections in different layers of the implosion capsule. And these are called ablator materials, materials on the outermost component of those. And so I decided it would be really exciting to study what is influencing the seeding of these instabilities, in particular looking at voids. So pore spaces or voids, these sorts of imperfections are common in rocks. And so coming from sort of a geosciences background, thinking about these kinds of imperfections are also, there are also really interesting applications for porous material under shock compression and driving excess heating, obviously. So in this context, the different imperfections in the ablator material, one of which is shown here on the right-hand side. So here's a diamond ablator, and using CT, computed tomography, or different kinds of X-ray imaging, you can actually visualize the voids. But then taking that and shock compressing these samples and tracking as a function of time the collapse of these voids, and then the jetting, the plasma formation and jetting over time is very important to, again, understanding what aspects of our physics models are spot on, are correct, and what do we have a little bit wrong or a lot wrong. So really marrying our in situ measurements with physics models, radiation hydrocode simulations in 2 dimensions and in 3 dimensions is the direction that we want to go. So I take another little aside here. So what we're going to do is look at these voids using X-ray imaging. And I wanted to comment on, there's actually quite a range of different approaches for X-ray imaging. They're all very exciting. If you recall, I should have mentioned or may have mentioned that one aspect of an X-ray free electron laser, besides its brilliance and short pulse width, is its coherence. So the coherent and this is again another laser-like property where it gets its name. And so the coherent properties of LCLS or any XFEL really enable a whole suite of what are called coherent diffractive imaging techniques. And depending on your optics and where you place your sample with respect to focus, I sort of show, if we look down here at this bottommost graphic, there are different, there's different sorts of fidelity you're able to extract. Spatial fidelity, certainly less than a micron. And so that's where we're going to be focused in sort of the Fresnel to Fraunhofer region in looking at these void collapse images. So we're hoping to get, of course, we want a few nanometer resolution. The best we've done so far in a shock compressed material is 400 nanometers, which is still better than a micron. You can still claim submicron. Static images, our resolution currently at MEC is down to 60 nanometers, but we're certainly trying to push that moving forward. So for this campaign, looking at void collapse, we have two approaches. The first of which we'll talk about is this 4-pulse direct imaging. So what does that mean? So it means I'm going to take the 4-pulse train from LCLS. I'm going to take 4 electron bunches, and they go through the undulator, and then the electron beam, there's the electron beam dump first, and then we have this sort of suite of 4. I don't use the shortest spacing because our detector, the Icarus detector, the gating isn't quite that short. But it's a few nanoseconds, again, suitable to the sort of shock physics timescales that we're interested in. When I say direct imaging, what I mean is that the focus of the optics and the focus of those optics is downstream of our sample. So we're able to collect images of the void and then the void collapsing, assuming I time it right, and we can track the evolution of that collapse. I will say one of our grad students working on this project, Daniel Hodge, will have a paper out shortly on this work in Optics Express. So we're really excited about that. When we get there, in a few slides, there's a complementary campaign that took place where we were really trying to drill in to higher resolution. So the detectors often set a few important aspects of resolution. So here, the best we did was about 700 nanometer resolution, spatial resolution. In the single shot, we did about a factor of 2 better, so 400 nanometers. And this is in a phase contrast regime. So the lenses that I just mentioned before are actually upstream of the target. So we're in a magnification geometry. And this is actually more a more traditional technique in shock physics. This is also deployed quite a bit at the advanced, at the advanced photon source. I was about to say ALS. At the advanced photon source, the dynamic compression sector, DCS, CAT at APS. And so here we were able to leverage 18 keV X-rays from LCLS, whereas here we were down at 9. Part of this is the camera again. So if you have a very thin chip, thin silicon chip, then the high energy X-rays are going to go right through. So it's not optimal for signal to noise. Whereas here in a single shot, we had more versatility on the detector we could use to resolve the features. And in either case, again, our goal is to track this collapse process and extract densities in 2D. So that's really our goal, is to do iterative phase retrieval and get the areal density maps, or the mass density maps. And this is hard to do, okay? You can leverage other approaches, absorption radiography, flat field correction, but this application of the coherent properties of the LCLS to really push the frontier on coherent diffractive imaging so that you can quickly and easily extract a robust density at any point at any location in your detector is really exciting. Okay, so this first study, the 4-pulse direct imaging work, I want to also mention, actually for both of these, the samples were key. So here's another shout out to aspects of high rep rate, targetry and needs coming down the pike as we accelerate how quickly we can pump and probe our sample. We need a really robust way of target fabrication. And so my postdoc, Sylvia Pandolfi, just had a paper, it's coming out soon, it's in press, editor's pick, hooray, in RSI. And so she developed a unique way of using traditional photolithography to synthesize a sample that had an embedded void. This is a thin shell of silica, actually, that's in an SU8. SU8 is a photoresist, so it has a composition very much like polyimide, so it's a plastic. And so she designed a protocol, a procedure for embedding very precisely these features, these spheres inside of our plastic material. And then we did check, we did some CT to make sure there wasn't any leakage or contamination of the void, the interior part of the void, that it really was empty. And so her description of sample preparation and application is in this nice paper coming out soon. So we used Sylvia's delightful targets and we blew them up. And so first, our approach at lower X-ray energy at about 8 or 9 keV was used in concert with the 4-pulse camera. And so I apologize, there's no time scales on here, but these are each 2 nanoseconds to 4 nanoseconds apart, each time slice. So it's the same target. We get to look at it 4 times. And so here, what we've tried to do is outline where's the void in each time slice, where's the starting location of the void in each time slice. And actually by this time slice, it's about, so 2 + 4 is 6, at about 6 nanoseconds. You can actually see, it's probably hard on your screen there, but there's jetting of the material, right? So it's actually translated, it's entrained in this front, and it has moved downstream. This is another way to, is it this one? Excuse me, no, it's this one. Over here, there's a zoom in of that feature. And so we are able to collect these data. And we find, actually, part of the work of Daniel Hodge from BYU, part of his thesis is focused on how do we get the right flat field? How do we get rid of all this gunk in the image? So it turns out beryllium lenses that are used to focus the X-rays at X-FELs, they have a lot of blemishes, and that's problematic. Moreover, remember I told you that the X-FEL beam has this spontaneous emission, this self-amplification spontaneous emission, SASE property, which means it's stochastic, right? So spatially, it jitters around. Bandwidth, right? The color also changes a little bit. And temporally it's pretty locked in. But anyway, so we've got a bandwidth jitter, a little bit of bandwidth jitter, a little bit of pointing jitter. And what that means is we're entering the compound refractive lenses, these beryllium lenses, slightly different each pulse. So what Daniel tried to do is apply a combination of principal component analysis and image alignment for this flat field correction. Did the best he could. And we were able to get to a point where it was the best we could do. And then we can compare that to 2-dimensional hydrocode simulation, so-called X-RAGE from Los Alamos. And this is work also spearheaded in part by a graduate student at University of Rochester, working with us, and also in particular, David Montgomery, who's a wonderful collaborator from LANL. And so these X-RAGE simulations are shown down here in the bottom right in yellow and blue. And you can actually see qualitatively, so we're not quite at the quantitative yet. Remember, I told you we're getting there. Qualitatively, as far as timing goes, features, key features in the image, we're matching up pretty well. But the next thing we want to do is start turning on other aspects of the physics that we want to check. Radiation transport, strength, all of that is currently turned off. So this data set is probably not good enough to do that check. That's for the high resolution campaign that we pursued. But this is an exciting way to validate the data that we're getting from this ultra-fast X-ray imager and 4-pulse train is essentially getting it right, that we're seeing a lot of the features that we need to see. There is an opportunity to do density. So from the raw data, there's sort of time scale information that we can get, but not density information unless we pursue, there's a suite of phase retrieval algorithms that we could apply here, one of which is this transportive intensity, this TIE method, which is being spearheaded by a wonderful postdoc at LANL, Andrew Leong. And so here's an example of a TIE approach that he applied to these set of 4 images. But it's tough, right? We're having some normalization issues here. We've got some negative values. So we can't directly pull density off of here yet, but it's possible. This is also for a single phase. So a single material is where this approach works really well. And here we've got 2 different starting materials, the silicate, silica wall and the surrounding SU8. But so this is preliminary sort of analysis, but it shows that we're able to sort of march forward sequentially. And one day, you know, we hope to have the ability to do this 4-pulse train or multi-pulse up to 8 or 16 pulses. And each one instantly gives you a 2-dimensional density map of your shock as it proceeds through your sample. So that's really exciting. That's the direction we're going. High resolution. So we compare that data using the Icarus detector and the pulse train. You see I'm running out of time, with application of a different set of detectors that give us a bit higher resolution. So the other thing we're changing here is the X-ray energy. So first we were at 8.2 keV. And part of the problem here, we also notice, is that oftentimes the cool features we want to see when the void is collapsing is obscured by what we started referring to as the black fog. Sounds like from a pirate movie. So this, we think it's the ablation front, and what's happening, what we were able to model actually, is that this is an effect of refraction. So we're getting refraction here, and it's obscuring our view of the shock front and the ablation front. Whereas if we, because of the high density, I should say, and so the 8.2 keV simply cannot punch through that opaque material. Whereas here we're able to get to even higher pressures in the SU8, but we can punch through with 18 keV. So again, another opportunity, another advantage of LCLS copper undulator upgrades that take us now up to 25 keV. So slightly harder X-rays allow us to see through more high dense material. And so this is a really nice side-by-side comparison, sort of the features and aspects of the compression we're able to see between a static shot, the initial image. So it's only 1 image per shot in this case, and the driven image. And so there's lots of fantastic detail, the initial shock front, the compressed region in the SU8, aspects of the curl up, edge curl up. We'll see more of that in a second, and then the ablation front. So we were able to get to 400 nanometer spatial resolution here, which is really exciting as well. And so the grand comparison between our XPCI X-ray phase contrast imaging data and the 2D X-ray. So here I show a series of panels. The upper set of panels is the data, and the bottom set are the 2D X-ray. And so we're starting to see similarities qualitatively that are similar between the shock compressed collapse features in the void and aspects of the 2D X-ray. But again, we are matching in terms of time scale and flow, but we haven't turned the physics, different aspects of the physics models on yet. So we are able to get to phase retrieval and areal density of the static image. So It would have been the left-hand side of the images you saw before. And so that's really exciting that just starting from the raw data, we are able to deduce, measure the densities in the static image. And we're getting very close to being able to do this for the dynamic, for the driven image. And so this is moving forward again, spearheaded by Andrew Leong. And so we're close. Once we get this dialed in, then we can start to compare to X-range and then start with radiation transport coefficients, implement strength and the like. And that's where we're really able to thumbs up, thumbs down different aspects of the physics model and build that predictive capability. I know I'm running out of time. I did want to showcase another application of imaging in concert with diffraction. So another key piece of XFEL experiments is leveraging more than one diagnostic at a time. I think we do that a lot as shock physicists and in HED and plasma science. So why not have imaging and diffraction? And so here's a study done by another grad student who's now moved on. She works at Google, looking at compressive wave, a suite of elastic and plastic waves transiting silicon, transforming to a high pressure state. And then she went in and she selected different regions where the field of view was zoomed in quite a bit. And we can extract not only the image, but also the diffraction from that very isolated point. And we can combine that to come up with a holistic picture of the transformation process and the mechanism. There are a lot of other opportunities for the next generation of scientists, and it's exciting to think about what we could do with these X-rays in concert with shock propagation. One of which is steering the X-ray beam in different ways. So actually coming up with a stereoscopic or multi-angle view. I know there's some great work being done at Livermore on this point, also for MECU. But we tested a split and delay to steer the X-ray beam, split it up and recombine it so that we can get stereo imaging of our sample. We could do that with 4 pulses or 8 pulses. So imagine that. There's a lot of data that we're going to be collecting. And if we go to even higher rep rates, of course, that's going to mean, drinking from the fire hose in terms of data and data analysis. So this is where, again, machine learning and AI can certainly play a role. And I know there are other aspects of that tied into thinking about high rep rate advances as well for IFE. I threw in a couple slides here on a different kind of X-ray imaging technique. This one's called tychography. And in tychography, you essentially overlap where you're sampling on the X-ray probe on your sample. You have some percentage overlap and you move that around, you sort of raster scan on your sample. And the diffraction data look, it's a very straightforward diffraction pattern. there's a lot of information encoded in here, but a single shot is hard to tell what's going on. But we've actually done this 2D and 3D tychotomography, and it's really exciting. We can leverage this to reconstruct images of different test patterns. And here the resolution can get really small, which is wonderful, really tight resolution down to 20 to 50 nanometers. Here's actually a copper foam we're studying in concert with folks out at Livermore Lab, copper foam material. And we recently completed some tychotomography to actually visualize the nanofoam in 3 dimensions. And applications of these and other imaging techniques in a single shot approach, right? Because where do we want to go with these exciting imaging and diffraction and spectroscopy techniques is to do it in such a way that you have time resolution, that you can do it in a single shot as your shock wave is moving through. And so time resolved, fill in the blank, whether it's Bragg, coherent diffractive imaging, which is often done with just a single crystal. We talked about tychotomography. These are all in the hard X-ray regime, challenging, not yet deployed, but I think the clear frontier, the clear opportunity is there. I'm not going to talk about all of these because I do want to get to, in the remaining 30 seconds, the future of MEC, which is bright. Got to wear shades. Okay, anybody? We are excited for the MEC upgrade, which is basically a petawatt upgrade and long pulse kilojoule upgrade to our laser system and extension of our footprint within the LCLS Hutch series. So we'll have a dedicated target area that will include whatever laser you want and the LCLS, and a separate target chamber for laser only experiments, which I'm going to touch on in just a second. And so this was really supported widely by the community. I know I see a few of us here from the APS, DPP, CPP, the community group that was able to work with FES and FESAC to put together a long range plan for FES that included a description of what the MEC upgrade could do and some technical, I'll get to that in just a second. So this is where I want to invite the next generation of scientists who are interested in doing experiments at the MEC, at the MECU, at LCLS. There's a lot of opportunity for engagement here, and you should feel free to reach out to myself and others at SLAC for what are your exciting ideas where you can leverage some of these unique utilities, parameters of the LCLS, and with what we're hoping to get in MECU. And the footprint, then lots of construction will have to take place, but we're actually going to excavate and build into the side of a hill. And the steering board or the committee, the UAP panel for helping to understand what parameters are best for MECU is currently active and soliciting information. So just a few notes on the technical parameters that we're hoping for MECU are listed here. So petawatt laser upgrade, this would operate at 10 Hertz. And again, we'd be pushing the frontier certainly in fusion science, fusion energy science and technology. The compression laser, that's sort of more the flavor of experiments I talked about today, upwards of a kilojoule. There is a bit of interest from NNSA to actually augment this and have a larger laser. So we could talk about that offline. I welcome you to check out the design report for our conceptual design. We're currently in CD1 right now, and it's really an exciting time. I think there's so much opportunity. And with that, the notion of opportunity, besides leveraging proposals to explore and use the LCLS to probe, X-ray probe, you can also do laser only experiments. And so here's another sort of body consortium of different facilities, so-called LaserNet US. And this is a relatively new consortium and group that brings together different facilities across the United States and Canada, where you can apply for beam time and do really exciting laser experiments. And I welcome you to go to this website and check it out. Lots of user outreach and engagement. I happen to be the PRP chair, so I'm happy to answer any questions for LaserNet proposals. It's been pushed out a little bit for cycle 5 to March 2023. But this is another opportunity where we can bring in the next generation of HED scientists, plasma physicists, earth scientists to explore the most extreme regions of our universe. And with that, I will advance to the final slide, where I certainly need to acknowledge a host of collaborators, colleagues, too many to rattle off one by one, but really fantastic institutions, and certainly thanking the funding sources, NNSA, NSF, and of course, Office of Science, FES. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so